Okay, so we're going to focus on AO3 context through an inspector course. So if you have a look at the screen there, it's a collection of all the contextual links that can be made with this particular play. So just have a look at all these and we'll go through them bit by bit, and there's a little quiz as well just to begin. So one by one, that information is going to come on the screen, and then there'll be some questions to do with it. So if you're going to do this properly, it's up to you how you do it, but if you're going to do it properly, have a look at it, and then without looking back, have a go at answering the questions. So bits of information to do with the play and the context will come on one by one. Okay, so that's all the information, and it'll disappear, and there'll be some questions to do with all of that stuff on the board. Okay, so bit by bit, you don't need to write out the questions, just the answers. So who wrote the play? What year was it written? What did the writer want to achieve? What year is the play set? What was it also known as? So the something age. What time period was this known as? And during this time there was a huge something divide. What was it? What percentage made up the working class? What strike was there? What was it called regarding women and fighting for their right to vote? Women were also seen as what class of citizen? This meant that it was, and this isn't actually on the board, but in other words, the answer to question 12, what is another word for a male-led or male-dominated society, and it begins with P. Name for an ideology which meant equality in society. Name for an ideology regarding greed and self-gain. So basically it's the opposite to question 13. Who was Prime Minister during World War II? And this Prime Minister wanted to go back to what age? Who succeeded him as Prime Minister? So who came after him? What came of his leadership? And then name the society that wanted fairness and equality. The something society beginning with F. Okay, and now I'm just going to go through the answers for each of those questions. So I don't know if you need to pause it just to fill in the answers, or you're ready for them, but here they are. So number 1, it was Priestley or J.B. Priestley. Year it was written, 1945 for number 2. 3, anything to do with people to take responsibility, equality, anything like that. Place set in the year 1912. Number 5, it was known as the Golden Age. 6, Edwardian era or Edwardian period, as long as you've got Edwardian, that's fine. 7, there was a huge class divide. Number 8, it was 80%. Number 9, miners' strike. Number 10, the suffragette movement. 11, second-class citizens. 12 was patriarchal or patriarchy, whichever one. 13, socialism or socialist. 14, capitalism or capitalist. 5, Churchill or Winston Churchill. Number 16, he wanted to go back to the Golden Age. 17, Clement Attlee or Attlee's Fine, who came after Churchill as Prime Minister. The NHS for number 18. And 19, it's the Fabian Society. So all of that there are the answers. So just a couple of things just to recap here. So socialism versus capitalism. Socialism is the idea that production, distribution and exchange are owned or regulated by community. So basically it's equality, it's fairness for everybody. That's what socialism is. And capitalism is basically the opposite, where it's controlled by private owners for profit. So it's greed and self-gain, a bit like Scrooge from A Christmas Carol. Okay, in this case, Mr. Burling is very much a capitalist, and Priestley's views are very much that of socialists. So a couple of bits of information here. The important bits I've just put in red there. So it's written after World War II. Many British men went away to fight during the war, and positions in work had to be filled by women. So there's a reason why it was written in a particular year, because we'd have seen a lot of change in society at that point. So a lot more fairness and equality for women, and men had to acknowledge the fact that women were just as capable as them. But you've also got struggles between the two sort of time periods. So the struggles of, you can either say working class, or another word for working class is proletariat, proletariats, and the growing success of, say, the bourgeoisie, or if not the middle class is what the bourgeoisie are known as, so industry and business owners, so your Mr. Burlings, your Gerald Crofts. And there was a big divide between the rich and the poor, so a big class divide, and the rich perceived poor people to have no manners or sophistication, almost like outcasts or animals in society, untamable and wild. And it was strongly believed that no poor person could ever become wealthy. However, there was a concept that was being voiced at that time, socialism. And socialists believed that everything in society is made by the cooperative efforts of people and citizens alike. A person who uses their wealth to invest in trade and industry for profit in accordance with the principles of capitalism. So this is a little bit of information to do with sort of the effects of the war. So it ended in Europe on the 8th of May 1945. They celebrated, but were obviously recovering from nearly 6 years of warfare, danger and uncertainty. So it was a society that needed to be almost rebuilt and therefore needed to change. And looking at the class divide, it created basically a huge problem earlier on in England. But during this time period in 1945, it had been greatly reduced. And so that gap had decreased. So that was a huge difference between 1945 and 1912. And there was a social frustration. And because of the effects of World War II, everyone had kind of had to pitch together and work together during the war. And for working class people, there was a reluctance to go back to the old ways, the Golden Age, which was the Edwardian era. And because of what I said earlier about war, and women were acknowledged more during this time period, they had a more valued place in society. They contributed significantly to the war because men would go off and fight, and of course women had to be the rock as well as the spiritual guide. They had to make sure that everything was as good as it could be at home regarding the family and supporting the family. And so women wanted more opportunities in life, and that also meant in employment. So with Winston Churchill, although victorious in World War II, and it was celebrated, wasn't long after that that he was no longer Prime Minister. And the reason why is because he wanted to go back to what was called the Golden Age, which was around about 1912. He wanted to go back to the idea of people, a ruling class, a very heavy kind of rigid class system where you had the working class, the middle class. You also had the upper class as well, and he wanted to go back to that, but of course that was 33 years ago, and of course time had changed, and people wanted that change and seen that change was a good thing. And then you had Clement Attlee and the Labour Party. Labour Party always stood for, and stand for even today, this idea of equality. It's the working people's sort of party, and they introduced many changes, including something that's talked about today, the NHS. But if we go back to 1912 very briefly, class, as I said to you before, time of peace and stability in Britain, so it seemed, but the lower classes struggled and were disadvantaged. Their education stopped, and it would be limited to reading, writing, maths and non-academic subjects. So obviously they had little opportunity to progress, academically speaking, compared to, say, the middle and upper classes of society. So they were already disadvantaged and already seen as unequal, and words that I would use: superfluous, subservient, less important, inferior, any of those words. But once they had a job, there were few laws set in place to make sure they were paid fairly. There was no such thing as minimum wage back then, and because there was no such thing as minimum wage, it meant that the workers, the employees were basically, they were able to abuse their power and position and pay their workforce whatever they wanted. And you look at, for example, Mr. Burling paid the women of his workforce whatever he wanted, and it was obviously very poorly paid. This is why characters such as Eva Smith tried to challenge that and wanted higher wages, not only for herself but for the rest of the workforce. So obviously there was a lot of inequality then. But if you were wealthy, you lived a life of luxury, and it really did create that separation between the classes. It's a very rigid class system. But in particular for women, they were expected to be subservient, so obedient to men. So this was very much a patriarchal society. Women were seen as cheap labour, second-class citizens. Men were expected to work to support the family, and women were expected to stay at home and raise the children. It was expected as a woman to be married and have children. That was your opportunity in life. So only men who owned property could vote. So that was basically a middle and upper class part of society, and those were the people that lived in luxury. So therefore they loved what was going on. They loved the class divide. They loved ruling above others, so they didn't want to change anything. Women weren't allowed to vote at all, and women's lives were controlled by their fathers and their husbands. So for example, you can look at Eva Smith in Inspector Calls, and you can look at Sheila Burling, the daughter of the Burling family, being controlled by her dad, Mr. Burling, and her future fiancée, Gerald Croft. And the argument was that it was pointless to allow women to vote. They would only vote as they're told by their husband. Something that you might have come across, might not have come across, something that I've done with my classes is the Fabian Society. So the Fabian Society, basically, it was a socialist group, and it was around the late 19th century when this society existed. and it was to advance the principles of social democracy. So basically, it was a group that wanted to promote fairness and equality in society. Okay, and that's something that Priestley really sort of encouraged. Writers George Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells, they were both supporters of socialism and part of this Fabian society, and their works often tackled social inequality. H.G. Wells, for example, science fiction, he was the backdrop to challenging this sort of mindset. For example, he wrote War of the Worlds, being one of the more popular pieces of writing. But why is that all relevant? Because it's actually referenced by Mr. Berlin. Berlin references both writers in a critical way. Like, he hates this thought belief system. He hated socialism because Mr. Berlin was a capitalist. And here's an example. He says here in this quote, "We can't let these Bernard Shaws and H.G. Wellses do all the talking. We hard-headed practical businessmen must say something sometime." And so he's basically challenging that and dismissing it almost as like, this is nonsense. So he's trying to stamp out socialism. Referring to it as like nonsense. He says about bees in a hive, community and all that nonsense. Doesn't like it, doesn't like the idea of people mixing and reducing that class divide. He wants to rule above others. So Fabian society, another good contextual link. So with all of that contextual knowledge, how does that look in essay writing? So on the next slide, you'll see a basic sort of essay, just a short piece of writing on how Mr. Berling is presented. So here is an example here. Priestley presents Mr. Berling as a character who is arrogant and puts himself before others, as he believes that man has to look after himself and his family too, of course. This suggests to the audience that how his status is more important than anything else, as his capitalist beliefs dominate his life. It could also suggest how he mentions family almost as a way of projecting a personable and relatable figure, using them to support his own arrogance and narcissism. As the patriarch of the family, Priestley underpins his dominant nature through how, and now if you look at this, it says, what is the writing in purple? This is your AO3, this is your context. How society was very patriarchal as the Edwardian era was unequal regarding how men treated women. It's correct, there's nothing wrong with that, it's absolutely fine, but if I was marking out, if any other English teacher was marking that, there's always room for improvement. So how could we make that better? What could we do to make that better? So if you look on this slide, so I'm just going to read from where it starts in purple. It says how society was very patriarchal as the Edwardian era was unequal regarding how men treated women. Fine, absolutely fine. But what you could do to expand on your marks is further develop. So during this period, so what else could you say? Women were seen as second-class citizens, and therefore they had no rights and a voice of their own. So this led to the suffragette movement and women's strikes, which were done to achieve equality. So you're just expanding on what we've said previously about being patriarchal, Edwardian era, unequal, men treated women, stuff like that. You're just expanding, you're just developing. It's not a history essay, but you do want to be able to distance yourself from the play and explain a few things about what was going on during this time period, what the playwright was trying to achieve. And what you could do, and I've put it there on the left hand side, is you link it back into whichever skill, whether it's AO1, which is making inferences, or AO2, which is language analysis of structure. So if you look here, this juxtaposes with Berling's capitalist and patriarchal beliefs, and then you link it to AO1 in this case, showing an audience of 1945 how outdated and primitive he is through his arrogant and self-centered narcissism. And by doing that, you strengthen your AO1 and also your AO3, because everything you're saying is justified and relates to the question. And that's basically everything to do with context and how it looks in an essay. And hopefully that's been useful.